Welcome and thank you for joining Philadelphia Magazine's ThinkFest 2021. My name is David Murrell. I'm a staff writer here at the magazine, and today I'll be speaking with Brad Ingelsby for our session, Philadelphia on Film. Thank you to our sponsors for this event, Bank of America, Penn Medicine, St. Joseph's University, Western Governors University, and GoPuff. Please remember to join us for these conversations all week at noon and 4 p.m. daily. If you miss any sessions, we invite you to check out the recordings at phillymag.com/thinkfest. Up next is our conversation with Brad. Please be warned, if you haven't yet seen Mare of Easttown, that's on you. There are spoilers to follow. Brad Ingelsby is the creator and executive producer of Mare of Easttown, the hit HBO series starring Kate Winslet. The show earned 16 Emmy nominations this year. Brad has also written a number of film screenplays, including 2020's The Way Back, starring Ben Affleck, and 2013's Out of the Furnace, which started out as a script by a different name that got the attention of one Leonardo DiCaprio. And if that weren't enough, he's a Philly area guy through and through. He attended Archbishop Carroll for high school and Villanova, where his dad happened to be a star basketball player. If you've seen Mare, you'll notice some parallels here. Brad will be talking today about Philadelphia in film, what it was like to shoot Mare of Easttown in and around Philadelphia, and kind of the legacy of Philadelphia as a setting in TV and film alike. So thanks for joining us.
Of course, happy to be here, man. Appreciate you guys having me.
So you're actually not in Philadelphia at the moment. Where are you joining us from?
So I live in Irvine, California, David. I've lived here for about 12 years, and it's a lovely place to live. But I am actually moving back to the area. We are moving back. It seems like there's always a tentative, it's changed a few times, but it seems like we're going to be permanently in the area in June now. So I'm excited to move back.
Yeah, well, a preemptive welcome back. Now, I know you grew up in the area as well. I think you grew up in Berwyn, which is so that's help me out with this, because this is a panel about setting, and I just want to get one thing straight. Berwyn versus Easttown. What's the difference?
Well, so Easttown's a township, right? And so Berwyn is exists in that township. Now, the Easttown of the show is really a composite of a number of places. And we picked Easttown as a name because it sounds kind of like a generic enough name that it could exist in sort of any state in the country, really. But really the Easttown in the show, I would say, is much more, it actually doesn't resemble the real Easttown township. It really resembles, in my mind, I would say Coatesville. We did a lot of shooting, Aston, Springfield, and probably Drexel Hill. So it was kind of like we, chose those areas as the inspiration and we created our own Easttown. And so some people who live in Easttown are saying, oh, it's not really like Easttown, but for people who are outside the area, they don't know Easttown really. So we could kind of make our own Easttown in a way.
Right. So tell me a little bit more about what the sort of choices you made in creating that composite, because I know, the show is it has these Delco accents. It has a very Delaware County vibe.
Yes.
What about Delco was kind of an enticing setting for you? And I assume there was more to it than just kind of a stroke of evil trying to make, your actors, master the notoriously difficult Delco accent. So beyond that, what was the thinking?
Well, I think that's where my grandparents grew up. And so I spent a lot of time in Delco, and it's where my wife grew up and where her parents live now. And when we go home, we spend a lot of time there. So they live in Aston, actually only a mile away from the stages where we shot. And so this was a story that was decidedly kind of, it's a story of a community, a working class community. And that, to me, those types of people have always been very interesting in my work. I feel like if I looked at all my scripts, especially the ones I've written on my own, that weren't a part of a studio job, they've all been primarily about, I'd say, working class individuals who are going through some sort of trauma in their life. They have to overcome something in their life. So that's always been a part of my work. And I don't know, I think it's just how I was, I think it's how I was raised, David. And so that kind of, I guess, the work ethic, the blue collar world has always felt like home to me. Even though I grew up in Berwyn, in Chester County, I spent a lot of time, just living and just getting acquainted with that lifestyle, and it's how my parents were raised, and so it's always been appealing to me, and I think it's the heroic in the kind of everyday. And so having Mare live there, again, I knew those streets, knew those people, knew the interior of those homes, and so it was a familiar life, and I felt like I could speak to that way of life with some level of conviction and honesty. And so that was the appeal. And then, having gone back to Aston and having been there a while with my wife, that just felt like the right place to set the story. And so yeah, I think it was a combination of all of these things that I wanted to portray a community in a certain way. And Delco was the right, it was the right, and it checked a lot of the boxes we wanted to achieve in the show.
I'm curious, how involved were you with the kind of location scouting process? I mean, as a writer, I wonder
Yeah.
the extent to which you're putting things in the script where you're like,
Yeah.
this is where I want this to be,
Yeah.
and especially since you kind of grew up in the area, you have that firsthand knowledge, whereas you could also delegate that to a location scout who kind of comes up with stuff. So how did you sort of balance, what you were writing in your mind's eye versus what ended up on screen?
Yeah, well, it's funny you said, David, because usually in the movie scripts I've done, I've never been so specific. I would just say, it takes place in the woods. But in this script, because I grew up there, I was able to point to specific places, Ridley Creek, or it was, Coco's Pizza. And even if we didn't ultimately end up in those exact spots, I was able to tell the locations team to go there, and they could go inside those places and get inspiration, and then use those inspiration points to go and get a spot that looked exactly like. So I was really involved in the locations on this project, and I could send them to the bars that I thought Mare would go to, obviously the beer Mare would drink, the bar.
Yeah, I want to ask you about that. We'll get to that later.
But all the locations were really, really specific. And Keith, the production designer I'd worked with on a movie before, and he was always really eager to hear about that. So I sent him all the photos I had as a kid growing up in my grandparents' houses, and he would model, especially the Carroll home in the show. The Carroll home was the older couple that Mare visits in the beginning of the series. Like, that house specifically was designed after my great aunt's house. And so I think especially on this project, I could be really, really helpful in saying, this is what I had in mind, and let's try to get as close to that as possible.
Was this the first project that you were really involved on, like on set? I mean, because I guess I wonder, as a screenwriter, in theory, it seems like you could write your script, sell it to someone, and then it just kind of goes off into the world and gets made. Whereas obviously you were executive producing this, you were, I assume, kind of in and around the whole process. Was that a new thing for you, or not?
It's a good question. It kind of depends on the director. I've worked on movies where the director wants you around a lot and wants you involved and wants you on set. I've worked on other movies where the director, as you said, sort of like, I have the script, I'm good, see you later. And so it really depends on the director. But I can say that I was never as involved in any project as I was on Mare. And like even in the locations, obviously writing the script, but in the location, in the costumes, David, working with Megan, the costume designer, and saying, I think Lori would wear the Dave Matthews Band shirt because that's the band that would come and play every summer, 9 shows. And so I could lend a level of authenticity to this project in a way that maybe I wasn't able to on movies. But so, yes, I was really, really involved in all aspects of the show. And I loved that I got to be such a big part of it all. And especially because it was such a meaningful story about where I grew up, how I grew up. And again, I didn't grow up with a murder investigation, but I grew up inside those homes, having those conversations. That way of life was really important to me. And so, yeah, this was definitely the most involved I've ever been on any project.
There have been plenty of films, and probably the same goes for TV shows, that have been set in and around Philadelphia, but were not actually, filmed there or produced there. I mean, they're kind of, maybe an obvious example is like The Philadelphia Story, classic film with Philadelphia in the title, that was, shot in a lot in California somewhere. That's obviously a film that is way less preoccupied with the setting, despite the name, than Mare of Easttown is. But I'm curious what difference it makes to film on location, where you're actually setting the show? I mean, it seems like it would be difficult to spend all of this time in and around Delco and in the Philly burbs and not have some kind of trickle down effect, even some subconscious impact on yourself and probably the actors who are spending time in the area. So what's the difference?
Well, that's a great, I mean, I think, like you said, it's the trickle down effect. HBO, we went into them, with the pitch and with Kate and the scripts, and we said to them, we have to shoot it where it's set. It's a show about community. It has to be shot in this community. And a credit to HBO that they completely agreed. And like, I think it's the aggregate, David, like that it begins to seep into your skin a little bit, it gets in your bloodstream, and I think the actors could say this as well, is that, just being in a place where you're hearing the accents, you're driving the streets, you're seeing the shops, you're seeing how people live. The people on the set are, a lot of them were in the area, had lived in the area. And I think it's like, it's little bits and pieces that accumulate over the course of the show, and the aggregate of that is a lot. And so I think, as you said, just being in the area, hearing the accents, just driving out to, the actors would go and eat in the pizza shop, or they would go have dinner somewhere in the area, and they talked to the locals, and we had local cops come to the set and work with the actors. And again, I think it's little bits and pieces that begin to add up. And if you can steal a nugget here and you steal a nugget there, someone says something to you that resonates, or an accent, a word resonates in some way, and you pick and you get, over time, those little bits and pieces accumulate. And I think that in the end, what people responded to about the show was the honesty and the depiction of this community. And I think that a lot of those little moments came from just having the actors there in the community on set. We shot in Aston, a lot of it, we shot around, but the stages were in Aston. So a lot of the time we were there, and just, having the actors live in the area, it paid dividends ultimately. And I'm really, really happy and grateful that we had a chance to be there.
Yeah, I think I saw that in an interview somewhere. Kate Winslet was talking about, getting her morning coffee every day at Wawa or something. So, but you mentioned these little nuggets that you steal from real life. I don't know if anything comes to mind off the top of your head, but I'm interested if, there are moments that sort of made their way into the show that were kind of, offhand things that the actors or you or anyone else on set kind of just experienced by virtue of being, around where you were.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. I think, you know, Evan's accent, I know, was, we got Evan in touch with a couple local cops, and he went around with one in particular, and this cop who, Pete works in Marple, I think, and him and his brothers would go around with Evan, and Evan he would actually tape their conversations, and the Baylor brothers were Evan's influence in terms of his accent. And I think just being around the Baylor brothers, was huge in terms of Evan actually mastering the accent. And so that was one thing. If we had been in New York, or if we had been in North Carolina, he never would have been able to go around with those brothers. And that was sort of his inspiration point. And so, I mean, there's been, I could name like 100 little things, the Dave Matthews Band concert t-shirt, being home, we would pick the beers, what songs were playing in the bar was super important. And that was like asking my buddies back home, like, what were the songs, everything was super important, again, because I think if you're trying to tell the story of a community, you got to get the details right. And I would imagine there are like 100 others, but but those were some of the ones that stick out to me right now.
Right. So you wrote the screenplay for a film called American Woman, which I believe was also set in Pennsylvania, but shot in Massachusetts, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, how involved were you with that process? I mean, was that a decision you made, and either way, I'm curious what you see as like the distinctions between a film that is not shot where it's set, in that case, versus Mare, which obviously we just talked about is.
Yeah, it's a good question. And so that one we tried to shoot in Pennsylvania, but the tax credit had run out, David. Like as there was an issue that, it was a timing thing. And so what we did then was, is they would send me location, they had a locations manager in the Boston area that was going around. And I had modeled that. I think in the script, it was Aston again. And so he was sending me pictures, and I would say to the director, Jake, oh, that street looks, I think that's what I have in mind. Now, a lot of it, Jake has to make decisions based on how it's going to look, and he has a lot of decisions to factor in. But I could at least always steer him in the direction of, yes, I believe that's Aston. I believe that's this. Now, American Woman, an hour and a half movie, maybe a little bit longer. So, all those details, maybe don't ultimately aggregate in the way that Mare does, which is a 7-hour show. But I think, on that one, I could say to Jake and Mike, the producer, yeah, that looks like what I had in mind, or I've been to a grocery store that looks like this and it's convincing enough. But yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I wonder, how it would have been different if we shot in the area. And listen, I would say to you that if I ever have a chance to shoot something where it's set, I'm 100% doing it, because again, you just never know the impact it has, and you don't know until you're there, with the crew on set every day. But I can tell you, it's gonna be better than shooting it, elsewhere. And so if a lot of factors go into that decision, but if you can make it work to shoot where it's set, I'll 100% do it.
Right. I think you're probably far from the first person who wanted to shoot something in Philadelphia that was foiled by the tax credit situation, which I know there's a long history about that we don't need to get into. But
right, exactly.
I also wanted to ask you about I assume there's maybe something especially, maybe daunting or exciting about shooting a show that's set in your hometown, and I don't know if I would not call Mare like a love letter to your hometown per se. It's more of a hard look, right? I mean, the people there are, as you mentioned, often heroic, but also, sometimes dealing with addiction or depression. I mean, it's sort of at times a bleak, portrayal of a certain type of American, community. Did you have any fear of, I mean, I know it's not the real Easttown, but still, of, people coming back to you being like, this is what you think of, what do you think of this area? Like, really?
I think, obviously, yes. I mean, of course, I think, when you're, as you said, it's not the most lovely depiction of the community. But I think what we wanted, my goal always in this, David, was to have a empathetic, a portrait of the community, that despite what was happening and despite the addiction issues and the trauma and the mental illness and the things that the characters have to deal with on a daily basis, that the overwhelming emotion, I hope, that the audience would leave with, was the sense of resilience, and that in the face of these hardships, especially the women always had each other and could always lean on each other, even when they had arguments and squabbles and they held grudges, and there was a sense of betrayal with Mare and Dawn at times. There was always this sense of that when the chips were down, we had each other's back. And so I think that yes, there are issues that these characters have to deal with, but what we were interested in was portraying this community with a real sense of resilience. And I think that, and at least I hope that's what people left with, was the resilience of these characters at the end of the show, that that Mare goes to Lori, that Lori is able to love the child that has caused the downfall of her family, that Dawn gets the house gifted, that her that it comes from Beth, that there was a sense of community in the face of struggle. And so I hope that's what people leave with, that yes, it's dark at times, but there is a real humanity in all of these characters.
Right. So around the time that you started production on Mare, Jason Segel's TV series Dispatches from Elsewhere was filming in production in Philadelphia. The Creed movies have been shot here. Concrete Cowboys brought Idris Elba to the region. I think it's, right now there's a non-zero chance that somewhere in Philadelphia, Adam Sandler is playing pickup basketball while shooting or preparing to shoot the movie Hustle that's about to come out. What there has sort of been, it feels like in recent years, a kind of obsession, to like all of these big movie stars are now coming to Philadelphia and shooting projects. Certainly with Jason Segel, people were seeing him all over the place. Same is now going for Adam Sandler. To me, this feels new in some kind of way, even though they've been making movies here for a long time. I guess I'm curious, having grown up in the region, if you agree, if you feel as though there is some kind of like Philadelphia is having some sort of increased prominence or something in depiction in film and TV right now, and if so, why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as a kid, I remember there were movies that would come and go. Obviously the Bradley Cooper movie was there, the Silver Linings, and there were movies. So I'd be interested in seeing if it's just recently that there's been an uptick in the production. I feel like I could be wrong. I feel like there were always movies coming and going, but it's a great city with a lot, with so much character and history. So I'm surprised that it's not a consistent, hub of production, because you think about the city itself and then the suburbs, and it seems like, it's fertile ground for any production. You can go anywhere. You can go into the city, you can go to the shore, you can go to the suburbs. It seems to have everything within an arm's reach. And so, it's a good question. I'm not entirely sure if it's just recently that there's been an interest in it. I feel like that's a city that should always have a huge interest in terms of production. And listen, I can say to you that I'll always write everything in the area. And I don't know if it's just out of laziness, because I know, I know the area, so it's easier to write a place, but if I could have every production go in the city or around the city, I would, because it's such rich soil. And again, a lot of that comes from, I'm writing about characters who grew up there or around the city. So it makes sense. But I loved shooting there. It was such a joy. Everyone was so supportive. The community was so supportive. And when the show came out, they were so supportive. I still get texts from people, about the show and the Halloween costumes of Mare. And so anyway, listen, I would encourage everyone to shoot in Philly, because it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
Well, that is a nice segue, because as someone who has now pledged, and we're going to hold you to that,
Yes.
that you're going to be making everything in Philadelphia. M. Night Shyamalan famously has made, he has broken his promise twice, I think. And Old is the most recent movie of his that was not in fact set here. It was set in the Dominican Republic. But that's, I think every decade you get at least one mulligan, you can go somewhere else. That seems fine. But I'm curious, there obviously is this kind of rich history, even if it hasn't necessarily prompted the kind of fan ogling maybe that maybe happens now, but there clearly is a history of great film that, Philadelphia as a setting, really. As someone who, probably pays great attention to setting and just sort of how, movies that are made in this milieu that you are now writing about, are there particular films or TV shows or just depictions of Philadelphia that you think that were sort of inspiring in any way, or that you've looked to and thought, this is a great portrayal of Philadelphia?
It's a good question. There's nothing while I was writing Mare, and maybe this is just on everything that I write, David. It's more, how does it impact, how does it impact the characters I'm writing? So it wasn't as if I thought, oh, I'm going to emulate that movie I grew up watching because it impacted me in any way. I think it's like, whenever you're setting out to write something, it's, it's how do you use the setting as a character, and not every movie has that, right? But obviously Rocky, you have these, iconic stories that are associated with the city. And that in many ways is a movie that I can look to, just in terms of the content, the narrative itself, a kind of, underdog kind of hero story, but done in a more honest way than we, normally get to see. But I think it's not necessarily that I was impacted as a kid thinking, oh, I want to do my version of that. I think it's sort of when you're writing a character, a world, I always try to think of ways to make it as honest as I can. And the reason you try to do that is because, it's the old saying, in the specific is the universal. The more specific I can make this character, this world, and the bigger its reach, or the greater its reach, I think. And so I guess to answer your question, I was less inspired by a certain movie. I mean, but I would say to you, a movie like Breaking Away, not in Philadelphia, but Breaking Away, Indiana, is a movie that I would look to and say, oh, that's a movie that is about a group of characters, but they are impacted and changed and molded by a sense of place in such a way that the sense of place, the place itself, is a character. And so that's not a Philly, movie, but I would say to you that movie is what I was trying to achieve with Mare, that it's a sense of place. How has it impacted these characters? And how will it continue to impact these characters in a way that's meaningful? Or how will they in some way not allow it to impact them? How will they break the mold, in that case, of his parents? But so anyway, if I had to pick a movie, I would look to that movie, which is a story about Indiana, a coming of age story in Indiana. And that is what I was trying to do in Mare, is get a sense of community and how it impacts Mare and shapes Mare and her friends and family, really.
Right. Yeah. Rocky is obviously the kind of quintessential example. It's also, to me, it's a funny one because or not necessarily a funny one, but I feel like the greatest compliment that a city can pay to a movie that has set itself in Philadelphia is now naming part of its actual real life world, the Rocky steps. Yep. From the film. It's like the film has now encroached from yes. encroached on reality from yes. the fictional portrayal.
Yep. So. Yep. Exactly right. Exactly right. I guess that's a testament to the power of the movie, that it's lasted the way it has.
Right. Clearly, it's like shaping the conception of the city. Lingering on. Yep. I wanted to ask you too, just since, and I think you've even described Mare as sort of more of a character study than anything else, even though obviously it has the kind of whodunit plot, element to it as well. But the setting, clearly, as we've been talking about, is really important. I'd be interested to hear you kind of describe the setting in a little more detail, sort of as you would as if it were a character. Sort of what you think about the setting in that particular series.
Yeah, well, I think of the house, I think of the house where Mare lives as like a Drexel Hill house where my grandmother grew up. I mean, that was sort of what I had in my head, and my grandmother lived on Mason Avenue. And so, and I can remember, having dinners there every week with, my mom and her sisters, and being in the kitchen. And so I think what I was trying to achieve was, a sense of my sort of upbringing at the dinner tables, listening to these conversations, and how can I use that to establish the interior life of Mare at home, but in a kind of in a sense of how it shaped her character. What I wanted to establish was that here's a woman, like a lot of people I know in my life, who was born and raised in a certain place, and so what you have in these communities is a shared history with a lot of people. And if in Drexel Hill, you don't refer to people as their last, it's the Ingelsbys from, and then you name the parish. It's the Ingelsbys from St. Norbert's. It's the Ingelsbys from St. Matt's. And so, but what I wanted to establish in the show was that you had a detective, David, who had this kind of a moment of glory in this town. And my dad was a basketball player, and when I go home, I'll go into a restaurant and people still come up to him and say, I remember seeing you play and at the Palestra, and you did this, you made this shot. And so years and years later, these memories continue, which is a lovely thing, that you could create a moment in your life that people still can point to, remember where they sat, remember who they were with. Like that's a wonderful thing, I think. And so, but it has a cost, and in this case. And so what I was trying to do was establish a woman who had a wide net of allies and friends in the community, and had created this moment of glory in a town that didn't have many moments of glory. And so what that does as a character is it creates a lot of conflict now, because you, as a detective, you're in this community and the personal and the professional are getting crossed every single day. You're having to investigate all the crimes in this community, but you also know everyone in this community. Not everyone, but you know a lot of people, and a lot of people know you. And so that becomes a conflict that is interesting, right? How do you manage the personal and the professional? And what was interesting to me was, okay, let's take this woman who people looked up to, and she held this image of herself in the community, and that image is crumbling in many, many different ways now, which is her son has killed himself. She's tried to maintain a facade of having it all together all the time, and we arrive in her life at the very point where she's just not able to do it anymore, and it's because of the death of Kevin. Her marriage is over now, and she can't actually locate this missing girl who's the daughter of Dawn, her friend from the high school team. And so it's interesting that the plot and the history are colliding at this moment. And that, to me, is something you can't really get in a big city, right? You're just not able to create that sense of a shared history with these people. You only get this in the small communities. And so I think that it's like the perfect storm in Mare's life, where the personal is crumbling and the professional is crumbling. And it's really a story of like, how is this woman going to hold it together? And the answer is she can't. She has to acknowledge things. She has to confront things that she's been kind of deferring. And so that, to me, was very interesting, that you get this sense of shared history, and then you're dropping into her life in this moment where all of that is going to collide. And the confluence of those events was going to make for a lot of drama, but also a catharsis ultimately. And so that was kind of what we were trying to do. And that community and that sense of place and that sense of knowing all these people and having history with these people, it makes Mare's job incredibly, incredibly difficult every single day. And then you add to that a murder in this town, a kidnapping, and you're like, oh my goodness, what's going to happen to this woman? So I think the only way to get that into the perfect storm, really, David, was to establish the sense of place. And that's why the opening episode is a bit slower than you would normally see in a procedural. Normally a procedural is you open with a body and the detectives are trying to figure out, who is this person? How did they get here? What's happened? But ours was different in that you took a whole episode to get to know, to get to know not everyone in the community, but a sense of place. And then at the very end of the first episode is when you drop the kind of inciting incident of Aaron's death. But if you didn't spend time with the community and understand Mare inside the community, then I don't think the events that followed would have the same impact. It was really important to establish the sense of place before you establish the inciting incident, so that as the events of the case start to unfold, I think the emotional impact is much deeper at that point, because you've invested in the community and not just Mare.
Right. And I think one reason why people in the region have responded to the show, aside from it just being a good, piece of writing and storytelling, is that, there are kind of these call outs to Delco, which is obviously fun. But I mean, it's also clear that the characters are very much acted on by the setting,
Yes.
And so it's like they're,
Yes.
They are products of the environment in a kind of a specific way, which I think people,
yes,
people recognize that more probably at a base level than just like the potato chips in the show, which is also fun to see too.
Right, exactly.
And this will be the last. And this will be the last thing that I just wanted to end with. And you alluded to this earlier, but the question of the beer. So first of all, there are these call outs in the show. There are, there's Wawa plenty of times, Coco's cheesesteaks, Hers chips, and then Rolling Rock and Yingling. Now, I had read in an article in New York Magazine that you actually, in the script, have put different characters drinking different particular brands of beer. So first I want to ask, is that true? And B, and this is the subject of some online speculation, so we might be like, getting the answer to a Reddit thread out into the world now. Why does Mare drink Rolling Rock?
Yeah.
Of course, still Pennsylvania beer, but not Southeast. As opposed to Yingling.
That's true. That's a good. So the easiest answer, David, is that when I go home, to Aston, Pennsylvania, and I stay with my in-laws. Her parents drink, it's Rolling Rock. And it's just in their house all the time. And I have to be honest, as a kid, I never drank Rolling Rock. I can't even recall having a Rolling Rock until I would go over to my wife's house and her parents would drink Rolling Rock. And I like Rolling Rock. And I also just, this is really, maybe it's the writer being kind of just like having to get every detail right. There's something about the Rolling Rock, it's the bottle itself that stands out. And I love Yingling, and that was the beer that I would drink as a kid. I mean, that's what we had when we were growing up. Yingling was the beer, and that's why I had Zabel drinking Yingling, because in my mind, Zabel was the guy that I would hang out with. And so I just always said, so when you meet him, he has Yingling, he's drinking it with his mom, or he's drinking it at his house when Mare comes over. So he owns the Yingling in the show. But Mare, to me, you know, her house was based on Aston, and I believed that I could see her having that beer. And also like that, I just love the green bottle, it's iconic. And so when you see her with it, it's sort of like, I don't know, there's something iconic about it. It sticks out in a way that just having a Coors Light, or maybe even Yingling, the bottle itself wouldn't stand out as much. So it was a choice to give Mare Rolling Rock. It stands out in a big way. I wanted to make a statement with that. And I've gotten some grief, but I'll take it. You know, I think Kate got a kick out of Rolling Rock too. So I'll own the Rolling Rock, but I understand the Yingling, you know, enthusiasts are upset with me, but we definitely gave Zabel the Yingling in the show.
Okay, great. Well, I'm glad we got to the bottom of that. I mean, after all, this is the Philadelphia Magazine ThinkFest, so you know there has to be some element of investigative reporting going on here. So I think we should end on that note. But it's been a pleasure speaking with you, and thanks for joining us and making the time.
Of course, I really appreciate it, David. Have a good rest of your day. Okay.
Yeah, likewise.
Okay. Talk soon.
Cheers.